Welcome back to the Badass Literature Society, where badasses come together to rate and review novels recommended by you. Hi, I'm Michael.
This is Barbara.
And I'm Lauren.
Today we're going to do something new for us for a bonus episode, a series of rapid-fire debates on various book-related topics. Each round's going to be about 2 minutes long, and yes, I'm timing it. So you'll need to keep your responses short and sweet, and make sure that we all three have enough time to speak. Now, for our listeners, if you are listening to this episode and you have an opinion about any of these debates, we would love to hear what your take is on either Instagram or Facebook. As most of you already know, our handle there is @BadassLitPod. But without further ado, let's jump in, or I guess I should say let's dive in to the debate. First question, ebooks versus physical books. Which is better?
Physical books.
Both for different reasons.
Yes, I think physical books because I like the smell of them, and there will never be anything that replaces like an actual book in my hand with actual pages. But ebooks, are we talking ebooks like Kindle?
Yeah, I'm assuming.
I mean,
so.
Technically anything, like Kindle,
Like an audio
iPad, audiobooks. No, we're talking
Okay.
about like reading with like looking at the words and reading them.
I prefer physical books, but I see the value in ebooks for convenience.
I like both. I like holding the book. I like having different bookmarks to use for different books and stuff like that. That's always fun. I like looking at the cover because you can see really cool detailed. It's in color and all that jazz. But ebooks are a lot easier for me to read when I'm doing other things because you have one hand while doing that and then like eating or scarfing food down and all that jazz. And for traveling purposes, ebooks are a lot easier to lug around because as a child, I would lug around like 4 books at a time. My mother would hate life. So both. I like both, and I refuse to pick one or the other.
I also like both. I think I am a little bit leaning towards ebooks, though, just because they are so damn convenient. Like reading at night with the Kindle or even the iPad is so much easier than a physical book. As much as Barbara would probably love to see a book hit me in the face instead of my Kindle
your
or my iPad.
Is funny hitting you in the face because that thing is massive.
Yeah, it doesn't feel very good. But it's just I like owning the physical book, and I like occasionally reading them out of the physical book. But there are a lot of books where like I have both copies because I prefer having the ebook in certain situations. So I'm definitely leaning a little bit that direction.
I mean, yeah, I prefer physical, but for easier access and stuff like that, I like both. But yes, I mean, if the world and I didn't have to travel and I could pack all of my books in one, it's books. Obviously.
A book backpack.
And that is time. Moving on to the next question. Standalone novels versus a book series. Which do you prefer?
That's such like a hard question.
Yeah.
It just depends.
Yeah. Both,
is it
again.
A shitty book? Like, if it's like a shitty book series, like, and the first one sucks, I don't want to read the rest. But if it's like a really good standalone and I wish there were more, then I would pick a series. So that's a hard question.
I think it depends on the book and the author. Like if it's a really well-written book, then I want more of it, even though I understand like, you know, that's what it is. It's contained one book standalone versus like book series. Sometimes I feel like books shouldn't continue on. You know, like, hey, maybe contain it to like 3 or 4 books in the series so it's not, you know, but I think it just depends. Like I said, like
it also depends how much time I have, right? Like
yeah,
if I'm wanting to jump into like a whole rabbit hole and read like 20 books, then okay, but otherwise the standalone is good.
Yeah.
You're not wrong. I think I lean a little bit towards series, though. I like a good standalone book, but I really enjoy most of what I own and I read is series.
Which is funny because you never finish them.
I am. See, and that's what I was going to say next, is that's the downside of the series, is that if they are super long and there's like a bunch of series that you want to read, then like there's so many series of books that I'm like in the middle of. A lot of them, the entire series is out to read, and I'm still like, because I'm juggling so many different.
That's so daunting.
I know.
Series.
I don't know how you do it.
So I'm going to say generally series, but I also enjoy a good standalone as well. Next question, reading, and this is kind of funny after that one, reading one book at a time versus reading multiple books simultaneously. What is your approach?
One at a time. My brain cannot focus on more than one book at a time. I could. The most I've read is 2. So if I have like a book club book and a podcast book, I'll be juggling those 2, but I still prefer to finish one and then start the other.
I definitely used to be just a one book kind of gal. And then with the podcast, it's kind of hard because there's other books I want to be reading, and so then I've tried to do it in a two. Like I'm reading one for the podcast and then one for myself, and I try to do those both together. Obviously, book like when I have to finish the book for the book podcast, then I will read that one first. But I try to have two at the same time because there's so many books out there that I just want to read. But I used to definitely, literally right before the podcast, I would read one book first and then start another one because I don't like doing multiple.
So I mean, pre-podcast, I definitely tried to read one book at a time just for sake of remembering the story. But I obviously have had to do that with the podcast if I'm reading a longer book, and so I actually have found that I enjoy in the same way I enjoy like watching multiple TV shows at the same time. I enjoy reading more books at the same time. Like I'm not talking like 5 or something, like nothing crazy, but like 2, maybe 3. I don't mind that, especially if like there's one that I feel like I really like I need to read the book, like actually read it with an e-reader or physical book versus one that I can just listen to. Then I really like that balance personally, but that is just me. Next question, hardcover versus paperback. Hardcover all the way for me.
Hardcover is my preference, but it's also a lot more expensive sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like, the paperback ones just don't hold up as well.
I mean, all the things Lauren said. I prefer hardcover, but it is a lot more expensive. So when I was a poor child in college, I bought a lot more non-hardcover books. But now that I have a little more spending money as an adult, then I definitely sometimes splurge and buy a hardcover.
Yeah, I like the hardcover. I like the way the hardcovers look on my bookshelf better. I like alas, a lot of my books are just Audible now, so.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely prefer hardcover, and if it is paperback, it has to be the bigger paperback, like the larger sized paperback. I hate the mass market paperback. While it's like super convenient, yes, it's super convenient. Obviously, like back in the day, I definitely owned some because like that was the easiest way to take a book on like a plane or a trip. You could bring more than one. But the text is just so small, and I have big hands. It's unwieldy at times. I prefer the larger paperback if I had to do paperback, but definitely prefer hardcover or e-reader. But that's not part of this thing. Next question, then, fiction or nonfiction? Which genre is more enjoyable to read?
These questions are stupid for people who like all the books all the time. That's just
everybody has preferences. Everybody has preferences.
But like I feel like, okay, maybe this is just my problem because of the way my brain works, but I feel like every answer is going to be, it just depends for me because.
Well, we're discussing it though.
I feel like I lean towards fiction, but I also love a good nonfiction.
I definitely lean towards fiction, but I think I read a fair amount of nonfiction. I've started listening to more nonfiction, which I really enjoy. I find that it's harder for me to listen to some fiction audiobooks while I'm doing something else. Like obviously like when I'm cleaning or something, I can listen to a fictional audiobook because cleaning is a relatively mindless task. But if I'm doing something like where I have to be focusing at least somewhat, I find it easier to listen to a nonfiction book because it's kind of like listening to like a documentary in the background in some ways. And I enjoy that. So I definitely do lean towards fiction though, for sure.
I would say I am probably 95, if not even higher than that percent of a fiction reader. I rarely read nonfiction. The only times I do are for autobiographies or stuff like that. And I think on my shelf, I have maybe 4 nonfiction books that are actually mine. I'm not a huge nonfiction fan. I'm one of those people like the world is already like a crap place and I don't really care to read more about it personally. So let me imagine a wonderful place that doesn't have issues. So give me fiction most of the time. I'd probably say I can't remember the last time I've read a nonfiction book. So I would even say it's like 99%. And then a one-off here and there when I really like a person, I want to read their book. But honestly, it's no.
I definitely read more fiction, but as far as like which ones do I think are more enjoyable, certain nonfiction is enjoyable too. Maybe it's just the wording I'm probably 95% fiction as well.
Yeah. I mean, and to be honest, I'm probably like 90% fiction. versus nonfiction. But I do enjoy, especially like I like I'm really interested in history, and I enjoy reading those. If there's like an interesting take or some new research that's come out and somebody wrote a book on it, I enjoy reading that. But book adaptations versus original works, which do you think are better?
I feel like that's hard to compare because that's the whole thing. It's a different medium. Like certain books are adapted well and are how do I say that? Like can be in a movie form or a TV form.
So
Is
in
that
this
what you
case,
mean?
actually, that's not no. So this is talking about like Star Wars was just a movie first,
Oh,
and then
then
they
you should have
made a book
explained that. Am
adaptation.
I the only
Yeah.
one who
That's
thought the movie?
No, I took it that way too.
so yeah. I mean, so yeah, in a book adaptation in this case, they're talking about a movie or something else that then they write a book of the
I
other
guess I don't
medium.
know what
So
things
what
like
would it be
what
like that? Yeah.
I've not done Star Wars, so
So I
Me
mean,
neither.
really, to be honest, like most popular movies, they've made book adaptations of. They've done some book adaptations of like video games or TV shows too. It was definitely a bigger thing. I feel like before now, like there were a lot more book adaptations.
I always
But
thought it was the reverse. Like the adaptations
Same.
are after from the book to movie,
Yeah.
screen, or
I literally
TV.
don't think I've ever read anything then. Can you
Yeah, I
like
don't think I have either.
Star Wars never read any of those. The Witcher never read any of those. If that's what you mean. Like is that examples?
I'm trying to
so
think
the
of.
Witcher wouldn't be because the Witcher was originally a book
Oh.
series that was then adapted into other works.
Well, there you go.
Star Wars is I mean, Star Wars is one. Star Trek, they've done that. I mean, if you think about any like popular franchise of like movies, TV shows, anything that's not from a book, they've probably made books based on that.
Okay, well then no. I've
Um,
never read anything, so obviously original work, so then that's an easy.
that
Yeah,
was going to be
I
my
don't
answer as well. Book adaptations are all fine and good, but I like reading original works.
I literally don't think I've ever read
I didn't even know that was a
one.
thing.
Yeah,
Honestly,
Although
me
we
neither.
were just talking about last night, Barbara, that you need to read the book adaptation of Star Wars to understand
Yeah,
the the lore behind everything. But
right.
I'll take a pass on Star Wars.
I know,
I
I know you
mean,
will.
yeah, I'm not gonna say anything. It is what it is. But yeah,
I made Barbara watch a Star Wars movie for Star Wars Day.
anyways,
Anyways, next question: traditional publishing versus self-publishing. Which path do you think is more advantageous for authors?
I'm not an author, so I would have no idea, but I feel like there's a revenue for both. Like some people do well in traditional and some people do well in self-publishing. I don't think there's a I think this is weird. I think
Well,
it's
I
both.
think people that, as far as being more advantageous, I think the downfalls to self-publishing is that there aren't as many eyes on the project. So,
Right.
like, we've read quite a few self-published books that, like, we're like, okay, there are some grammatical errors, or there are some like things that, and if it would have gone through like the traditional publishing process, it's like one edit, then two editors, and multiple sets of people are looking at it. So I think like it would be advantageous if a person can get it traditionally published, but I think like access wise, self-publishing is often the only option that people have, just because unless you're plugged in and know people, I think it would be hard to
Yeah,
go the other route. Or maybe it's
Right.
like if you have a lot of money. I don't know how that part works.
Right.
I'm going to say. I mean, like obviously, I'm not an author either, but I'm going to say I think that self-publishing is. I'm going to say it's more advantageous for authors because of how easily accessible it is today. I think that's incredible that there's so many more people that can get their stories out than before. Like they've companies like Amazon and other places have made it very easy. So I think in some ways that's more advantageous. I think traditional publishing, if you go that route, it's more advantageous in the sense you're probably going to make more money and sell more books because they have all of their strategies and things to get it out there. But I think that if we're talking about all authors, that self-publishing is probably more advantageous because it's more accessible.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
If I ever write a book, it'll be self-published.
Unless you could get an agent or something, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't get that lucky. It is on my bucket list though.
This next one I'm excited to hear Lauren's perspective on. It's audiobooks versus reading.
Okay, I'm going to cut everyone off. I think this is a stupid argument. You're reading. It doesn't matter. Like, yes, I know there's purist people who are like, oh, you have to read a book. No, if you enjoy that medium and you can read books that way, then who cares? You're still reading at the end of the day. As far as, like, is it better for you, like, for your mind? I'm not really sure if they've done studies and stuff like, because I know, like, people are saying, like, reading or doing Sudoku and that kind of stuff is good for your brain. So I'm not sure if they've done stuff for audiobooks. I would be very curious to know, but I feel like you're still doing that, so who cares? It's
I
the
think a study
reading.
like that would be very tricky because it's going to be different depending on the person, right? Because like some people
Hmm.
learn better
That's true.
auditory
Right,
versus
right.
vision.
Well, but I
And
mean, in
so,
general, though, reading, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you're a good reader or not. That's still
I
really
mean,
good for your
the question
brain.
here is really what you personally think is a superior way to experience a book.
I hate that word, superior way. Get off your
Okay.
high horse. It's both.
The
I
superior
feel like
way.
if you are reading, that's beautiful. Doesn't matter what medium.
I would agree. I think I've explained this on the podcast. So if you're a normal listener, you've probably heard me say this a lot of times. I always will prefer reading a physical book, like just because I like the experience of like feeling it in my hands. I like turning the pages. Like I like sitting down and like, I don't know, there's something about a physical book and about reading that I feel like is more about like the experience. You don't get that with audiobooks for me. Audiobooks are more like because of my phase of life I'm in with two kids under 4 years old and having to consume book media on the go, right? Like I'm listening in the shower, I'm listening in the car. Like otherwise I wouldn't be able to really read books at this phase of my life as much as I'm able to. So right now, until my kids are grown, I'm going to pick audiobooks or until they're a little more grown. But I will probably always have the opinion that I would much rather sit down and read a book than listen. Although, that being said, the audiobooks with the full cast, those are amazing. And I just heard that they're doing it for Harry Potter, and I'm super excited. So, yeah, that's a different experience.
It definitely is, and I was actually going to mention the full cast thing as well because there's at least a book that I've actually read the physical book, read it, and then I went back and actually listened to it because Graphic Audio did a full cast adaptation, and their like tagline, I guess, for their company is a movie in your mind. And it really is. It's like
It is.
listening to a movie. It's so because theirs is not just a full cast. They have like sound effects, and if there's like a battle scene going on, you hear like swords clashing and stuff in the background. It's a totally different experience. But I have found since I started listening to audiobooks, which because I really didn't before this podcast, to be perfectly honest with you, when I did read, I read the book. I really like audiobooks. I feel like I can get more reading done. I think that there, at least for me, that there's definitely some loss there because when you're listening to it, you're going to miss things that you maybe wouldn't miss if you were actually reading it. Like Barbara and I have talked about, like if we read the same book and she reads it and I listen to the audiobook, like she'll ask about something and I'm like, what are you talking about? And then she'll like point it out. It's like, it's right here. It's like, okay, well, I clearly listened to that, but I missed it. And that definitely happens with audiobooks, which is a downside. But I do enjoy listening. I think there's something about that. But like Barbara said at the beginning, there are some purists out there that are like, audiobooks aren't books.
Yeah. I mean, I don't use audiobooks, but I'm not ever going to trash on it.
Yeah. But I mean, that's because, but you don't use it
How
because
I do
you
it.
don't like hate on them. That's just
No,
not how
I
you
just
prefer to
can't.
read.
Like I can't do that. Like I've tried and my brain doesn't function that way.
Yeah. Which is different. Anyway, we went over time on that one. Next question. Plot driven versus character driven novels. Which type of storytelling do you prefer?
I feel like it has to be both because I feel like if it's solely character driven and there's not any plot, sometimes it can be dragged out and I feel like it's slower. And if it's just plot driven and I don't get depth to characters, then I don't like that either. So I feel like I need a good balance of both.
I think if you're a good writer, you do both. Personally, I feel like a great book is a combination of both. Because, like Lauren said, if you have only character driven, unless you're really really good at keeping people in the story and locked in, and it can be a little slow, like Lauren said. Whereas plot driven, then you don't connect to the characters, and then like, okay, cool, you have this cool story and all this action or whatever the case may be, but then it's like you as a reader can't really, I feel like, really latch on to the characters and stuff. So I think it has to be a nice balance of both. Or if you're a really good author, then you can do one or the other, but you do it well enough to where it overcompensates for the fact that it's not one versus the other.
So I definitely agree with that. What both of you said, that you prefer an author who can do both well, obviously. But I think if you make me pick one of the two, I can look over a book. I'm more likely to look over a book that's the plot is not driving it as well as I'd like it to be. But when a book has not well written characters and I'm not vibing with the characters, I am more likely to DNF that than I am one where the plot is dragging a little bit, but the character development is so good. And so for me, I'm going to do character driven because I love when the character development is so real that you're so good and real that you feel like you know these people, and that's not always the case with plot. So ideally both, but my personal preference is character driven. Next question: classic literature versus contemporary literature. Which era has produced better books? I know what Barbara's going to say, so I'm going to jump in and talk first on this one. I think that there's an argument to be made for both. I think there's some classic literature that still holds up and is fantastic and it should be like required reading, like a lot of it is. And there is definitely some that have not withstood the test of time that some people still believe are like the classics and, an amazing novel. And then you go read it and it's like, what is this trash? So I think that there's an argument that can be made for both. I definitely read more contemporary literature than I do classic literature. That's my personal preference, but there are a lot of my favorite books that would be considered classic literature. I think it's hard to say which era has produced better books because I think both eras produced books of their time. And I think if you can't, it's not fair to look at a classic piece of literature through the lens of 2024 in the same way it wouldn't be fair if somebody could time travel from the 1700s and read a brand new book and look at it through their lens. And so it's hard to answer, but I think that I think both eras have produced great books.
You've taken more than 2 minutes.
Have produced trash books, and that is all I have to say. And I'll stop talking now.
I feel like it's personal preference to an extent. A lot of like, if you study old literature, right, from the classics, from a literature standpoint, like when I was in college, like admiring literary things, like I'm like, oh, this is really poetic, or oh, this is really cool. Do I want to sit there and like read that regularly? No, especially not if it's like the Shakespearean type language or like the, I don't know, a lot of vows and arts and that sort of thing. Like it's harder for me to connect with just because like Michael said, like you're reading it through the lens currently. But when I go back and read those, do I think they're beautiful in their own way? Yes. So I don't feel like either of them produces a superior, using Michael's words, necessarily. However, I think some of contemporary literature is like the older days people would think is absolute trash. So
I have a lot of feelings about this. Classic literature is classic for a reason. I get that. But I hate when people come to me and say, I only read classic literature. Okay, you sound like a pretentious asshole, and I'm going to say that. Sorry, you do. The issue I have with classic literature is this. 99% of classic literature is white men. And as someone who is not a white man, I don't like that. I don't want to read about white men. No offense to white men. I'm not trying to trash white men. It's just, that is what it is. Back then, only white men were published. And if you weren't a white male, then you had to self-publish or like get hidden and all this other stuff. And if it was a woman, it's a white woman. So that's my issue.
They would have to use like pseudo
or yeah, names. They had to use fake names, pretend they were a dude, or they had to use their husband. A lot of the time it's their husband who got all the glory of the woman writing the book. That's what I have an issue with classic literature. I've read it in school. I've enjoyed some of them. I prefer contemporary literature because there's so much of it. Are we there yet for diversity? No, we're not. We need better diversity in books, better publishing in books, and all this other stuff. And I will die on this freaking hill. I prefer contemporary because there's stuff that I wish that as a child I could have read more about Latin women or just women of color and all this other stuff that you don't get in classic literature, and you don't get that point of view.
Oh, I think that's a really good perspective, and I appreciate you bringing that to the podcast.
Yep. Obviously that is, most of the classics are white dudes.
What was the and this is going to be like an aside, and obviously outside of a timer, but Barbara, what was there's a classic author that you were telling me like his wife actually wrote his stories?
F. Scott Fitzgerald. A lot of people are arguing that he stole his wife's, and she actually called him out on it.
That's interesting.
For her to introduce one of his books, she called him out on it, and then of course he put her in the insane asylum.
Of course he did.
So yeah, it's him.
Anyway, moving on to the next question. Fictional genres, fantasy versus science fiction. Which genre offers more imaginative possibilities?
It depends what you consider imaginative. Fantasy, because science fiction is based in reality, right? Science, unless you don't believe in science, I'm sorry. Science.
Lauren, whoa, what are you talking about? The Earth is flat, Lauren.
Okay, I'm sorry. If we have people who are flat earthers that listen to the podcast, this is your exit, okay? Golly.
Get
We don't want you to listen to our podcast. No offense.
Okay, if you truly believe that and you can listen, just don't let us know. All right, but like science fiction is technically based in something that's real, and it's just like a spin on that. So it's like imaginative in the sense of, okay, we know these things exist. Let's see like how we can take them and make them cooler or not cooler, depending on what you're reading. Whereas fantasy is very imaginative, and a lot of it isn't based in reality.
Yeah. I lean towards more fantasy. I don't mind certain science fiction. I think when they try to over explain it to me, I have trouble with that. Just because, yes, okay, I get it, but like flying cars is cool. I don't care how it's flying. Like, I really, like a little bit of science, sure, I don't mind that as a science person. I like that. Science fiction, I think, is interesting. It just depends. Like, I think it would be cool as humans to live in other planets and think of how that's going to work and how, I prefer fantasy just because it really is truly, like Lauren said, like, it's imaginative. Like, it's an endless possibility, but because it's not real at the end of the day, whereas science fiction has to somewhat be based on realness, because then I think if you're like overshooting, then you're like, oh, this doesn't really sound that, then I feel like it leans more towards fantasy in that sense.
I think that's fair. I think this is obviously a tricky one for me to answer because those are like my two favorite genres, right? And I think that you could answer and argue on both sides. Like both of you have already said that fantasy is like they're literally inventing their own world a lot of the times and the cultures in that world, and that's obviously incredibly imaginative. But you could also argue that it takes a special kind of imagination to write a science fiction story that's based in the reality of science, or at least the close to reality of science, and then make this fantastical world that is fiction. And I think that I think that both genres offer imaginative possibilities, but I think that it's different kinds of imaginative possibilities. And I think that that's why you don't often see authors that are able to successfully write both fantasy and science fiction, like separately. Usually, like that they're on one or the other. They can write fantastic general fiction, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that has done both really well. I'm sure someone's going to hear that and comment, "You idiot! This author did that," but I can't think of anybody right now. So that's my answer.
What do you mean, Michael? We're living just in this timeline right now. That's reality. I don't know. I'm just kidding.
Get out of here. Get out, Lauren. Get out. Let's see. Next question. Physical bookstores versus online bookstores. Which do you prefer, or where do you prefer to buy your books? Again, hard question. I like buying my ebooks online. Obviously, can't go to a store and buy an ebook.
Like, you can't. I mean,
you say that, but like people not books, obviously, but it'd be kind of funny if like you can go to like Target, for example, and buy a digital video game, like the little card says like, Mario whatever on it, and you take it home and type in the code and download it.
I mean, at that point, why don't you just do it online? Like, that's a waste of time.
When I thought of that, I imagined like Barnes and Noble having a whole section of just like cards with book titles on them for you to go to the store and buy the ebook, or like QR codes you could scan. For me, though, I prefer going to the bookstore. I think that that's a special experience. That's something that Barbara and I do all the time for fun, or something that's like for like a date. We'll go to the bookstore and like look at books together.
Take her, buy a dog.
The reason I said that, and I'll
no, you're a date
because I misspoke a little bit. One of the things that I really like to do for Barbara, if it's a special occasion or like a moment where like a gift would be given, instead of like buying her something, we'll go to Barnes and Noble, or we'll go to like a local bookstore, and I'll say, we've done like a bunch of different types where it's like you can spend X amount of dollars, or like you have like 10 minutes to pick out as many books as you can. And it's fun. I love the experience of going to a bookstore and looking
what the hell kind of budget do you have? I'd have a whole cart.
Looking through the stacks is fun.
He regretted that the one time he did the timed one.
I was like, man, I can get all the I can always take them back
plead
if
the
I don't like
Fifth
them.
Amendment on that one. But physical bookstores are my pick here. Absolutely.
Yep.
Without a doubt.
Physical bookstores, because also I could spend hours in a physical bookstore.
Same.
Just looking at all of the things and reading the backs. And like, I think James and I went there once for like a date night because he thought, oh, I'll take, like, we can go to Barnes & Noble and just like that Schillinger that. And I don't think he quite understood like what he was in for. This was in our earlier dating days. And he like lost track of me because he was looking in one section, I was in another. And then like he comes and finds me just like sitting in the aisle with like my stack of books trying to decide what I wanted. But yeah, convenience wise, obviously, like buying online is easy, and then it's delivered to my thing or to my door, and it's quick. But there's nothing that will ever replace a bookstore to me.
Agree. Physical bookstore, hands down. I'm sad that we're losing more and more of these shops and stuff because I think there's just a special something of going to a bookstore and picking out the books and touching and feeling and looking. Like, use all your senses. Well, maybe not. Don't be tasting no books, you weirdos. But for the most part, it's a whole thing. And I have fond memories of my mom taking me to like Borders, RIP, and like she would just grab
RIP Borders.
She would just grab a magazine, sit down, and let me wander for like an hour and a half. Or like we used to have a bookstore in our mall, and my mom and my sister would go shopping, and I'd tell my mom like, I'm gonna be in the bookstore, and she could always count that I would literally just grab a book and start reading. And luckily the guy didn't get too pissy because I would always buy a book. So but yeah, for sure, physical bookstore.
I feel like in that scenario, the manager is more likely to get irritated than like an employee who probably also loves books and doesn't care, as long as you're not destroying the books, which we all know how Barbara takes care of her books. So
yeah,
or putting them all back in the wrong places or something.
I would never.
Let's see. Next, reading for pleasure versus reading for self-improvement. What is the primary purpose of reading?
Well,
Pleasure.
That's up to the person, but for me personally, reading for pleasure. I don't self-improvement. I probably need it.
Deborah says, I don't have anything to improve upon.
I did actually not say that. I said the opposite. I probably should read for self-improvement. I've just never gone to books for self-improvement. I kind of just like YouTube, like, you know, how to cook or something like that. I don't know. But I 100% for pleasure. It's one of my things where if I'm stressed or having a lot going on, then that's how I disconnect from what's going on and just read.
I'll probably always choose reading for like self purposes or whatever, but I have done a lot of self-help book reading just with my career and then also just in general. But I always am going to prefer like my escape to the fiction world better. But I think there's places for good self-help reflective books. A lot of the books that like I'll read are books that I could potentially recommend to clients and things like that. So I feel like I need to have a good understanding.
That makes sense for your profession. I mean, when I was in school and stuff like that, obviously I read for learning. I love to read for learning purposes. I just prefer, I don't think it's like, I wouldn't consider that self-help, I guess, or self-improvement unless you're improving.
Yeah, that's more like knowledge. Educational.
Yeah, I like when reading for educational.
I think of like reading Codependent No More or reading like the, like learning yoga in 30 days or like those sorts of books that are more based on solely like improving certain areas versus like learning to cook or learning to sew or learning to fill in the blank.
Oh man, that's fair. I can see where you're coming from on that. And I also get, Lauren, with your profession, why it makes sense to read some of those self-help books that you can possibly recommend to a client. Speaking of Lauren, I'm really excited to hear her thoughts on this next one because she's definitely had some volatile thoughts about it on the podcast on different books. Open-ended endings versus conclusive endings. Which type of ending do you prefer in a book?
If it's gonna be a cliffhanger, Bethany, I'm looking at you. But to be fair, she did warn me. I just didn't read the warning. If it's going to be a cliffhanger, at least have the second book out, right? Like, so that I can finish the conclusion after.
So I think, and I love that you said that, and I hope Bethany is listening to hear it. For this question, though, we're talking about, like, this would be like the ending.
Oh, hell
like
no.
The end of a series, the end of a standalone book, not like where there's going to be maybe more.
No.
Like, this is the ending it's talking about.
Who does that? No. Conclusive ending, please. The only way the open ending open-ended ending would work in like a standalone would be like a situation where you still have a little bit of a conclusion, but then you're like, it's left open to interpretation of like, do they have kids? Do they like go out? Like, that like things are tied up a little bit, but you don't know like the rest of the kind of future. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I'd say that makes sense. This is a tough one because it all depends on how well it's written for me. Like there's some cases where an open-ended, like, we'll just it's up your interpretation what actually happened. I love that if it's done well. It can be a very compelling way to end a book because you find yourself thinking about it for a while afterwards. Like, well, did such and such happen? But there's also like there's times where I feel like there was a certain period where it was trendy to have an open-ended ending. And some people didn't do it as well as people who did, and that I didn't like. I think it also depends on the story. Like there are some stories where open-ended endings make sense because life keeps going, and there's others where you really need to have that conclusion.
I think I would prefer conclusive endings, but I think if done well, I don't mind an open-ended ending. But like it can't be so open-ended where I'm like, what the heck? Like, I don't have any answers. I need something. You need to throw me something here. So I would lean towards conclusive endings. Not everything has to be wrapped up in a pretty bow. Life isn't like that, so I understand. For the most part, though, something, because just open-ended without anything, like, yes, it breeds discussion and all this stuff, but like if you don't have anyone to discuss that with, then you're just talking to yourself, and that happens a lot to me, and ain't nobody like that. So and yeah, I don't know, I feel like I need something. If you just too much open-ended, then I feel like that I don't like that.
Next question. Literary awards. Do they accurately reflect the quality of a book?
That's hard. I feel like awards in general are hard because it's
very subjective.
It very much is. For anything like movies and TV shows and music and books, it's like, how do you judge that? Because like something that I absolutely love, maybe a lot of people don't, but like if it resonated with you, then who cares? But at the same time, I understand people who want that because that's maybe like your peers telling you you've done a good job. So I understand why it's important. I understand why a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on it. But I'm saying just as a reader and a consumer of this, I personally don't care if it's won any type of award, and that means for music, TV shows, movies, books. I don't care because if it resonated with me, that's why it matters to me. But if I did a movie or a TV show or a book, then obviously I'm going to care because then I that's how do you show that? Like, sure, maybe it's how many books you've sold or how many books have been I don't know. It's just, I understand. And so I feel like it's very tricky. Should it reflect the quality of a book? No. Does it? Unfortunately, sometimes we live in a society where it does. I don't think it should just be that, I feel like, and maybe there are authors there who love when people come up to them and say like, your book changed my life, or this is how much your book means to me. And hopefully that gives them the same serotonin as winning an award.
I think that you guys have covered this pretty well, but I think the literary awards, it's a great thing to look at to go find a book if that's what you're looking for. That because odds are it's probably going to be a solid choice. Not always, because like you guys have both said, it's subjective. But I think that if you're someone who's only reading books that have won literary awards, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, I'm a person that I don't really pay much attention to the award. Like when I read on the back of the book, like, oh, it's won whatever award. I don't pay as much attention to that, honestly, as I do like online reviews, which I also understand that there's some books that like I just don't pick up because they don't have good online reviews that I probably am missing out on. We were talking about that in my book club last week. One of the ladies is like, a lot of the books I read are like 3 stars on Goodreads, but I always rate them 5. Like maybe I'm just like have like certain tastes or whatever. But I do tend to not pay attention to the awards, quite honestly.
Next question, book length. Do you prefer shorter books that can be read quickly or longer books that offer more depth?
I reject your wording because shorter books can still have depth, even if they are
I love that. Just opening, I reject what you've said.
Short to medium books still can have depth if the author does it well. So I feel like sometimes, like if you take a short book that has a really good author and the characters are in depth and the plot is great, versus like a long book that they just like freaking word vomited
Stephen
and
King
dragged it
looking at
on
you.
and on and on.
Shots
I like Stephen King, but
I mean,
if you
I do
take
too,
like
but
a
sometimes he word vomits a lot. Like, let's cut
yes,
some of this stuff out, dude.
I think I would always choose like a well written shorter book because I can consume it faster versus like a book that just drags on. Now, are there longer books that I have enjoyed? Yes, but my preference is the. And when I say short, I'm not talking like little 200-page books. I'm talking like anything under 500 pages is considered short to medium for me.
To be honest, for me, I don't really care. I find if I mean, Barbara is sitting in our library, and if she looks at the books that are mine on the shelf, they're mostly quite long. But I really don't care. I mean, I have like 2 shelves in there because you graciously allow it. But I really, I mean, I think most of the books, I like a lot of books that are long, but I don't think that that's necessarily like my preference. Like I don't pick them because, oh yes, it's longer. I pick it because it sounds interesting, and if it's a well-written book, it doesn't matter how long it is.
Length isn't everything, ladies.
Ladies, right? I was literally going to make that joke. I do not care. If it's a well-written book, I will read it. If it's 100 pages versus 1,000, I will read it. I'm not scared of length because I know a lot of people are not a fan of length. I don't care. Give it to me, baby. I will read it. I don't care. Now.
And our normal PG podcast has been elevated.
No. It's fine. We haven't said anything wrong.
Just in the chat.
Exactly. Yes, as Lauren pointed out, or Michael, word vomit, whoever said that. Sometimes I feel like we can cut some things. And I know I mentioned Stephen King. I love Stephen King. I have a bunch of his books. Sometimes I don't want a room described for 3 pages. Cut that shiz down. Dude, please, like, let me as a reader imagine something, like sometimes I don't care about that. And then on the other end, sometimes I wish shorter books had that, but they have to cut something, and I feel like sometimes it's that. So I don't care as long as it's well written. I've never cared for length of a book, shorter or longer. Who cares? I will read both and love it.
There we go. Next question: rereading books. Is it worth revisiting books you've already read?
As in, like, is it worth rereading?
Yeah, like, is it worth revisiting books you've already read, or do you not really reread books and you just move on to the next thing after you've enjoyed it?
I reread my comfort books. Like I do a Harry Potter series reread. I used to do it every year, but now I haven't done it probably since Eliana was born. I'll reread certain, like, kind of like rewatching shows, right? Like I rewatch Friends because it's like a comfort show or whatever. If it's just like a one-off book that I really enjoyed, I'm probably not going to revisit it just because time. But the ones that like bring me all the nostalgia, I'll reread those sometimes.
So I used to reread books a lot more often. Once again, when I was a poor child and my parents could only buy a certain amount of books, I would just reread books because at that point that's all I had and I just wanted to keep reading. Now I feel like now that I can buy books and I have, I don't know, like over 200 books that I've bought and I need to read, I'm doing less of rereading books than I used to, but I definitely used to reread a lot of books. Like a lot of the ones that I have for a very long time on my bookshelf, I've reread multiple times. I don't do that as often because I have so many. I had more time as a kid than I do as an adult because I actually have to like be self-sufficient. Mom and dad aren't doing a lot of things for me anymore. So now because of that, my time that I get to do is less. And so then I prefer reading new books because I have so many I want to read. But I still get enjoyment rereading a book because I feel like every time you do, you pick up something, you see something new. And then I think if you have the time, you should definitely reread. And I don't have any issue with people rereading books.
Pretty much said exactly how I felt, Barbara. I definitely reread more when I was younger as well. I think it was less of a buying books and more of a time thing. I had more time to read when I was younger than I do now. I still, if I do go back and reread, like I enjoy rereading, the Tolkien books. I reread those from time to time. Harry Potter, I've reread. I know you both have reread those too. So yeah, I absolutely think it's worth revisiting books that if it's something you love and it brings you enjoyment every time you read it, then what's the harm in rereading it? Next up, book borrowing versus book buying. Is it better to borrow books from libraries or purchase your own copies? Totally a preference thing.
Support your local libraries, though, y'all.
Exactly. Download Libby, get the books on there.
Yep.
It's awesome. You can get them on your Kindle. Plus, I mean, it's fun going to the library too, right? Libraries are important. So I wouldn't say it's better to borrow, but it's great that all the options are available, so that more people have access to your book. And it's not like when you borrow the book from the library that the author is not getting anything. They still make money off the books that are sold to the library, and then they make a little bit, I believe, off of the amount of borrowing that happens with it too.
Yeah,
I think nowadays that used to not be a thing, but nowadays, right?
I think that's always been a thing. Actually,
okay.
Libraries have tracked that. So, I mean, yeah, whatever works for you. It's awesome that there's options.
Yep. I worry that physical libraries are going to become a thing of the past in the next 10 years. So I will
always support.
I will go on a soapbox for the need for libraries just for access. Not everybody can just go to Barnes and Noble and drop $20 on a book, right? And especially when we're looking at children and raising kids to read, and reading to kids is one of the most developmentally impactful things that you can do. And there's so many people that can't afford to buy all the books for their kids. So libraries are great. Obviously, if I borrow a book and I really, really like it and I'm like, I need this cover art on my bookshelf, then I'll go buy it. But I'm definitely not opposed to borrowing it either through Libby or the actual library.
Physical. I agree. I think both are very important. As a kid, I did more borrowing books. My mom would take us to the library and I would check out 5 if I was allowed, the max amount that I was allowed and stuff like that. And then obviously as I gotten older and I can afford my books, I buy them. But I still do. Honestly, for the book podcast, I check it out on Libby and stuff more than I go and buy it, unless it's something I really, really want, or it's one that I'm like, yes, I will go ahead and purchase this, or I already have. But that's actually normally how I do it, is I will use Libby for the podcast unless it's one I already own, and then buy the ones that I want and stuff like that. And like Lauren said, if it's something I really loved and I really enjoyed that book, then I will go out and buy it so I can actually have it.
The only circumstance I don't borrow books is from Barbara.
I don't like people borrowing my books.
I know.
Do you like living?
Yes.
That's a question you should ask. That's you have to fill out to make an account to borrow things from places, whether it was the library or the video store. For those of you that are older, Barbara's requirement would say, "Do you like living? Return book in excellent condition, and if you do not, you forfeit your life."
No, you just have to buy me a new one. You can keep the craptastic one that you borrowed because you've ruined my book.
I feel you though, Lauren. I'm always nervous if I'm reading Barbara's books. Okay, last question. Chapter length. Do you prefer shorter chapters or longer chapters, or no preference at all? For me, and I've never been able to explain this. I love books that are thousands of pages long, but I love short chapters. I love when a book has short, and by short I mean 10 minutes or less to get through a chapter. And this doesn't make any sense, but you could have 2 books that I'd be reading at the same time, and one of them is a James Patterson, Alex Cross book that has 80,000 chapters, but they're all 3 minutes. And the other one is the exact same length of pages, but the chapters are 30 plus minutes to get through. I will plow through the Alex Cross book in a sitting. But the other one, I won't read it as fast. With longer chapters, I don't know. I don't know.
Do you want an explanation, Michael? Because I have one.
I'm assuming it's an ADHD thing, probably, but
it's a neurodivergency thing, but it's also the dopamine that you get from completing a chapter. It is a small amount of oh, I finished that one, or oh, it's in your brain, right? It's a deadline or an end, a kind of an accomplishment almost, which then feeds the dopamine. So if you have shorter chapters, you're more likely to read for a longer period of time because you feel like you're accomplishing more when you have longer chapters. It could be that the same amount of words read, but you're not getting those small dopamine hits, which for ADHD is important.
The more you know.
The more you know. I'm exactly the same as Michael. So, except for that I don't read thousands of pages books often. I do prefer shorter chapters for the same reason.
So I like a happy medium. I hate really short chapters like the ones of what's his name? I'm not a huge fan of his.
James Patterson.
Yes,
You
where it's
don't like
like
how short his chapters are.
where it's like one page. I'm like, what is this? Because then I'm gonna read 50,000, and then I'm like, what year is it by the time I finish? So I don't like that short of chapters. I like the happy medium. I want like 10, 15 max. I don't like 30 plus chapters. I think those are too long. And then I'm like, oh no, I'm drudging through this, and that's a whole thing. And I don't get, I guess, apparently a dopamine hit. So I want a happy medium. I want it just long enough where it's satisfying and not short enough where it's too short. And then I feel like I've accomplished nothing and I have to read 20 of them to feel something and feel alive, you know?
Fair enough.
Mark.
Well, that's it. We made it through another bonus episode. Hopefully you all enjoyed our thoughts on these random book-related things. If you have thoughts about either your own opinions or your opinions about what any of us said, let us know.
Have feedback about today's episode? Contact us by writing to badassliteraturesociety@gmail.com. You can also send us a DM or leave a comment on Instagram or Facebook.
Make sure you're following Badass Literature for free in your favorite podcast app. Give us a rating and leave us a review if they allow you to. Super helpful for us. We can get some feedback and also helps our show get seen by
Shout out to Connie for leaving the best review ever.
Yes, that was great.
I had a giggle reading that one and made me cackle, and I sent it all to the other two.
And we added some more books to our schedule.
Hilarious. So thank you, Connie. I appreciate you.
Also, don't forget to be following us on social media if you're not already. Our username on both Instagram and Facebook is @BadassLitPod. And with that, we will see you all later this month for our full review episode. I'm Michael.
I'm Barbara.
This is Lauren.
Bye.
Bye. Except you flat earthers, we don't want you.